The lawyer's office smelled like failure and broken dreams. November 1992. Jake Henderson sat across from a man in an expensive suit who was about to destroy his life with a single sentence. "Your father left you everything," the lawyer said, sliding papers across the mahogany desk. The farm, the house, 240 acres of prime Iowa soil. Jake's heart soared for exactly 3 seconds. And the debt. The room went cold. "How much?" Jake whispered. $49,863. Jake felt the floor drop out from under him. His father had been dead 3 weeks. Heart attack in the field. 59 years old. Gone before the ambulance arrived. And now this. "The payments don't die with him," the lawyer continued, his voice flat, mechanical. $947 every month for the next 5 years and 2 months. Miss a single payment and the bank takes everything. 25-year-old Jake, who'd been working construction for 3 years making $9.50 an hour, stared at the stack of loan documents. John Deere 44440 tractor, purchased 1985, combine 1988, planter 1990, all financed. All still owed, all demanding their pound of flesh. "I don't have that kind of money," Jake said. "Then you have 3 options," the lawyer replied. "Sell the equipment, sell everything, or find a way to make those payments." But here's what nobody knew yet. What was about to happen next would change everything. Jake thought he understood about farming, about debt, about what's actually valuable in this world. The lawyer handed him an envelope. "Your father left you a letter." Jake's hands shook as he opened it. "Jake, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And you know about the debt. I'm sorry, son. I made choices I thought were right. Bought equipment I thought we needed. Financed it all because I didn't want to wait. I was wrong." The letter continued, and with every word, Jake felt his throat tighten. The debt became a trap. Every month, those payments came due. Whether we had a good crop or not, whether prices were up or down, the debt didn't care. It just kept demanding. By the time I realized my mistake, I was in too deep. Jake wanted to stop reading. He didn't. But here's what I want you to know. In the back of the machine shed, there's a tractor I bought before you were born, a 1953 Farmall Super M. I paid $300 cash for it in 1967. Your grandfather and I rebuilt the engine together. Jake's pulse quickened. That tractor still runs. It's old and slow, and nobody would call it impressive. But it doesn't have a payment attached to it. It's free and clear. If you decide to keep this farm, forget the fancy equipment. Farm with what's paid for. Live small. Save every dollar. Pay off the debt first. Everything else comes second. The letter ended with 8 words that would haunt Jake for the rest of his life. Never ever make the same mistake I did. Jake sat in that office for 20 minutes after he finished reading. Then he looked up at the lawyer and asked a question that would change everything. "What happens if I sell all the financed equipment right now?" The lawyer blinked. "You'd use the proceeds to pay down the loans. Whatever's left stays as debt. And the old Farmall in the shed, that's yours free and clear. No lien on it." Jake nodded slowly, and in that moment, everyone thought they knew what he was about to do. They were all wrong. "Here's what I'm going to do," Jake said. "But before we get to that, you need to understand something. This isn't a story about finding some clever loophole or gaming the system. This is about a 25-year-old kid who made a choice so brutal, so completely insane, that everyone, and I mean everyone, told him he was throwing his life away. If you want to know how Jake paid off $50,000 in 5 years with a 40-year-old tractor and a daily food budget of $5, You need to hear what happened next, because what Jake did contradicts everything modern farming teaches you about success. Jake's plan was simple: sell every piece of financed equipment, use the money to pay down the loans, then farm 240 acres with the only thing he owned free and clear: his father's 1953 Farmall Super M and whatever junk implements he could scrape together. The lawyer stared at him. "Jake, that tractor is 40 years old. You can't run a modern farming operation. Watch me. You'll fall behind. You won't be competitive." "I don't need to be competitive," Jake said. "I need to survive. There's a difference." The lawyer shook his head. "This is going to be harder than just losing the farm." "Maybe," Jake said, "but it's my choice." He signed the papers, took ownership of everything: the land, the house, the equipment, the crushing, suffocating $50,000 debt that came with it. Then he went home and started selling his father's dreams. The equipment auction was held on a freezing Saturday in December 1992. Jake stood in the crowd watching strangers examine his father's pride and joy. The John Deere 4440 that Dad had been so excited about in 1985. The combine that was supposed to make harvest easier. The planter that was going to help them cover more ground. All of it bought on promises. All of it still owed. All of it about to belong to someone else. The auctioneer started with the 4440. "Good tractor, folks. 7 years old, 2,800 hours. Who'll give me 30,000? Silence. 25? A hand went up in the back. The bidding climbed slowly. 27. 28. Stopped at $22,000. Sold. Jake felt physically sick. 22,000. He still owed 31,000 on that tractor, which meant after the sale, he'd still owe $9,000 on a tractor he no longer owned. The combine went next. Sold for 16,000. He'd owed 19. 3,000 still owed. The planter and implements sold for a combined 8,000. He'd owed 12,000 total. 4,000 still owed. When the dust settled, Jake had sold roughly $46,000 worth of equipment. He'd owed just under $50,000. After paying off what he could, he still owed $16,000. And he'd just sold all the equipment he needed to farm. The only thing left in his machine shed was the stuff nobody had wanted to bid on. The old stuff. The junk. A 1953 Farmall Super M that barely ran. A 3-bottom plow with rust eating through the moldboards. A grain drill missing half its parts. A hay rake held together with baling wire. Scrap metal by most standards. The kind of equipment serious farmers got rid of decades ago. But there was one critical difference between that junk and the modern equipment that had just sold. The junk was paid for. Jake's Uncle Tom pulled him aside after the auction. Tom had farmed successfully for 30 years, ran 800 acres with modern equipment, knew what he was talking about. "Jake," Tom said, "what are you going to do? You just sold everything. I've still got Dad's old Farmall." Tom looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "That thing's 40 years old. You can't farm 240 acres with a tractor from the 50s. Why not?" "Because it's too slow. You'll take 3 times as long to do everything. You'll miss planting windows. Jake, you can't compete in modern agriculture with antique equipment." "Uncle Tom, I don't need to compete. I need to survive." "You're making a mistake, son. You should sell the land, pay off the debt completely, start over somewhere else." Jake thought about his father's letter, about the warning, about the old Farmall waiting in the shed. "Maybe," Jake said, "but I'm going to find out." Tom shook his head and walked away, and Jake stood there in the empty auction yard, watching trucks haul away his father's equipment, wondering if everyone was right and he was making the biggest mistake of his life. His neighbors thought he was insane. His high school friends couldn't understand why he didn't just walk away. The bank officer handling the estate settlement told him bluntly he was throwing his life away. But Jake remembered his father's letter. Remembered the part about being trapped by payments, about the debt demanding its pound of flesh every single month. And Jake decided he'd rather be poor and free than comfortable and enslaved, even if it meant everyone thought he was a fool. Let me ask you something. Have you ever voluntarily made yourself poor to escape something worse? Have you ever chosen the harder path because you knew the easier path led to disaster? Because Jake Henderson chose poverty and freedom over comfort and debt. And it changed his entire life. That first winter, Jake lived in his father's house with the heat turned down to 60 degrees to save propane. The house felt like a tomb. His father's coffee cup still sat on the counter, his boots by the door, his coat on the hook. Jake couldn't bring himself to move any of it. He ate rice and beans every single day. Rice and beans for breakfast with an egg if the chickens were laying. Rice and beans for lunch. Rice and beans for dinner. He'd bought a 50-pound bag of rice and a 50-pound bag of pinto beans for $37 total. That was his food budget for 2 months. He wore his father's old coats because he couldn't afford new ones. They were too big, worn at the elbows, smelled like diesel and earth. But they were warm and they were free. He stopped driving to town unless absolutely necessary. Gasoline cost money. Every trip was 16 miles of fuel he could save by staying home. He worked construction 3 days a week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. The foreman had been willing to give him that schedule so he could work the farm the other days. Construction paid $9.50 an hour. 3 8-hour days was $220 a week before taxes. About $900 a month take home. Every dollar beyond food and utilities went into a coffee can in the kitchen. Literally an old Folgers can with a plastic lid, his debt payment fund. He'd write the amount on masking tape and stick it to the can. Week 1, 147 verse. Week 2, 289. Week 3, 431. Watching that number climb toward 947 verse. The first payment was due April 15th, 1993. Jake had from December through mid-April to save enough. 5 months to save $947 while also eating and keeping the lights on. He made budgets on notebook paper, tracked every penny. Construction income per month, $900. Propane, minimal use, $45. Electricity, $38. Phone, had to keep it for work calls, $23. Food, rice, beans, eggs, $18. Gasoline for truck, $40. Total expenses, $164. Money available for payment fund, $736 per month. Times 5 months, 380, minus 1 payment of $947. Left over for spring farming expenses, $2,533. The math worked, barely, but it worked. In his spare time, he worked on the Farmall. The tractor ran, but barely. It smoked like a bonfire. Leaked oil from every seal. The hydraulics were so weak they could barely lift a plow. It needed serious work. Jake spent his evenings in the unheated machine shed, bundled in 3 of his father's coats, his breath visible in the cold air, rebuilding that tractor. He didn't have money for a mechanic, didn't have money for new parts from a dealer. What he had was his father's old tools, a worn Farmall service manual he found in the shed, and memories of watching his dad and grandfather work on equipment when he was a kid. He pulled the engine on a Saturday in January. It took him all day working with a come-along and chain hoist. The engine came out covered in decades of grease and grime. He tore it down on the shop floor. Pistons worn, rings shot, bearings showing damage, valves barely seating. The engine needed a complete rebuild. New parts from a dealer would cost $800 minimum. Money Jake didn't have. money that needed to go to the debt payment. So he got creative. He found a machine shop in the next county that had used Farmall parts, bought used pistons for 30, used rings for 12, used bearings for 8. He cleaned everything with solvent, filed and fitted everything by hand, checked clearances with feeler gauges, did the work his grandfather had taught his father and his father had taught him. Total parts cost 93 tusser. He rebuilt the carburetor with a kit he mail-ordered for 6 tilint, fixed the hydraulic pump with seals that cost $11, went through the transmission and replaced the clutch with parts he found at a salvage yard for $40. By March of 1993, Jake had 160 invested in parts and probably 200 hours invested in labor, and the Farmall was running better than it had in 20 years. The engine started on the first crank, settled into a smooth, steady idle. No smoke, no leaks. The hydraulics lifted a fully loaded plow like it weighed nothing. Jake sat on that tractor on a Sunday afternoon in late March with the machine shed doors open and weak spring sunlight coming through. And he felt something he hadn't felt since his father died. Hope. Maybe this could actually work. Maybe he could actually do this. Jake was ready to farm. He had 240 acres, no equipment except one tractor and some salvaged implements, no money except what was in the coffee can, and a $16,000 debt that demanded $947 per month starting in 3 weeks. Most people would have said it was impossible. Jake didn't care what most people said. Farming with a 40-year-old tractor and almost no implements required creativity Jake didn't know he had. He couldn't afford to buy a plow, so he took the rusty old 3-bottom that had been rotting behind the shed and spent 2 full weeks rebuilding it. The moldboards were pitted with rust. The coulters were dull and bent. The hitch was seized solid. Jake sandblasted the rust off the moldboards, sharpened the coulters with an angle grinder, soaked the hitch in penetrating oil for 3 days, then heated it with a torch and beat it free with a sledgehammer. When he was done, the plow wouldn't win any beauty contests, but it would cut furrows, and that's all that mattered. He couldn't afford a planter, so he made a deal with his neighbor, old Bill Morrison. Bill would loan Jake his 4-row planter in exchange for Jake helping with Bill's wheat harvest later that summer. No money changed hands, just labor for equipment. The way farming used to work before everything became a transaction. He couldn't afford a sprayer, so he didn't spray. Just worked the ground well, planted good seed, and hoped for the best. No herbicides, no insecticides. Just dirt and seed and sun and rain and hope. He couldn't afford a combine, so he arranged with a custom harvester named Rick Patterson to cut his crop in exchange for 20% of the grain. It hurt to give up that much, but it was better than trying to harvest by hand. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't efficient, it wasn't what any modern farmer would call a viable operation, but it worked. That first spring, Jake planted all 240 acres in corn. He started the first week of April and didn't finish until the second week of May. A modern farmer with a modern tractor and a 12-row planter could have done it in 3 days. It took Jake 5 weeks, but he got it done. The Farmall pulled slowly, 3 miles per hour with the plow, 4 with the planter, but it pulled steady. What took a modern tractor 2 days took Jake a week, but acre by acre, row by row, the field went in. He worked from dawn until dark, started at sunrise, worked until he couldn't see the rows anymore, came home, ate rice and beans, fell into bed, woke up, did it again. There were setbacks. A hydraulic line burst on the planter, and he lost half a day rigging a repair. A thunderstorm came through and turned the field into mud, forcing him to wait 3 days for it to dry. The Farmall threw a fan belt and he had to drive to town to buy a replacement, eating into his precious cash reserve. But he kept going. By June, the corn was up. Tiny green shoots in long straight rows. Jake walked his fields in the evenings after work, checking the stand, looking for problems. The corn looked good, better than good. The ground he'd worked so carefully, without chemicals, without rushing, was producing strong, healthy plants. He lived on $5 a day, literally. Rice, beans, eggs from 6 chickens he'd started keeping behind the house. He didn't go to town unless absolutely necessary. Didn't buy anything that wasn't critical for survival or farming. Every construction paycheck minus his tiny living expenses went into the coffee can. By the end of April, he'd saved $147. He made his first debt payment of $947 at the bank on the 15th. Walked in with cash. Counted it out on the counter. The teller looked at him strangely. Most people paid by check or automatic deduction, but she took the money and gave him a receipt. Jake walked out of that bank with $200 in his pocket and a receipt showing he'd made his first payment. 1 down, 59 to go. Then he started saving again. June payment, $947. Made it with $43 to spare. He'd worked extra hours on a construction project that paid time and a half. August payment, $947. Made it with $11 left over. That month had been tight. The truck needed a new battery that cost $63. Had to come out of the payment fund. He'd made it, but barely. The math was brutal. He was earning about $500 a month from construction, living on $300. That left $200 for the payment, which meant he was making it by a couple hundred each month. No room for error, no room for emergencies, no room for life, but he was making it. Through the summer, Jake watched his corn grow. Waist high by the 4th of July, shoulder high by August 1st, tasseling in late August, looking strong and healthy. The best crop his father's ground had produced in years. And Jake had done it with no chemicals, no modern equipment, just hard work and good farming. And then October came, and he harvested his first crop, and everything changed. The waiting was the hardest part, watching the corn mature, watching the kernels dent and harden, checking moisture every day with a handheld tester, waiting for it to drop below 15% so it was safe to harvest. Finally, in mid-October, Rick Patterson showed up with his combine. Big modern machine. Could cut 8 rows at a time. Jake rode in the cab with him, watching his corn disappear into the combine header. Stalks pulled in, ears stripped off, kernels shelled and augured into the grain tank while the cobs and stalks got spit out the back. It took 3 days to cut all 240 acres. Jake watched every minute, watched his year's work, his hope, his survival turn into grain. When it was done, Jake had 28,000 bushels of corn in the grain bin. At October 1993 prices, $2.40 per bushel, that was worth $67,200 gross. Minus Rick Patterson's 20% cut for custom harvesting, $53,760 net. Jake stood there looking at that number on paper, and his knees almost buckled. His expenses for the entire year, seed, fuel, equipment repairs, everything, totaled about $12,000. His construction income for the year was about $18,000. His total income from both sources, $71,760. His living expenses for the year, $30,600. He'd actually managed to live on about $10 a day instead of $5 once the chickens got producing and he'd started eating a little better. His debt payments for the year, $11,364, 12 payments of $947. After all expenses and all payments, Jake had $56,796 left over. He sat at his father's old kitchen table with a calculator and ran the numbers 3 times to make sure he wasn't making a mistake. He wasn't. In 1 year, farming with a 40-year-old tractor and living on almost nothing, he'd earned enough to pay off the entire debt with $30,000 to spare. The remaining balance on his loans after 12 months of payments was about $12,000. Jake could write a check right now, pay it all off, be completely debt-free by tomorrow morning. His hand actually reached for his checkbook, then stopped. He remembered what his father had written about living free of debt, about remembering what it felt like to be trapped. And Jake made a decision that everyone would think was absolutely insane. He wasn't going to pay it off. Not yet. Now I want to hear from you. If you just earned enough money to pay off all your debt in one payment, would you do it? Or would you stick to the original plan and keep making payments to learn the lesson? Leave a comment, because Jake's choice here defined everything that came after. Jake kept making his monthly payments. $9.47 every month, like clockwork. On the 15th, in cash. Walking into that bank and counting out the money on the counter, the tellers got to know him. Started calling him Cash Jake. He'd smile and count out his bills and take his receipt and leave. But he took that $56,000 surplus from his first harvest and did something strategic. There was a 40-acre parcel adjacent to his property. Old man Henrikson had been trying to sell it for 2 years. It wasn't prime ground, a little sandy, a creek running through one corner that sometimes flooded, but it was workable, and Henrikson was tired of waiting for a buyer. He'd been asking $32,000. Jake offered $25,000 cash, told Henrikson he could close in a week if the price was right. Henrikson accepted that afternoon. Just like that, Jake went from 240 acres to 280 acres. All paid for. No debt on the new ground, no mortgage, no lien, free and clear. He used another $8,000 to buy more equipment at auctions and estate sales. A grain drill for $800, a disc harrow for $600, a grain wagon for $400. All old, all needing work, all paid for in cash, and he kept the rest, about $23,000 in the bank, emergency fund, safety net. Year 2, 1994, Jake planted 280 acres, half corn, half soybeans, crop rotation. The Farmall pulled everything. Jake was getting better at working with old equipment, learning to be efficient despite the limitations. That year's harvest netted $61,000 after expenses. The debt was down under $8,000 now. Jake bought another 30 acres from a widow for $28,000 cash. Total ground, 310 acres. Year 3, 1995. Jake was starting to feel like this might actually work. The operation was growing. The debt was shrinking. The Farmall, now 42 years old, was still running strong after another winter of meticulous maintenance. Neighbors who'd laughed 3 years ago were now asking questions. How are you doing this? The answer was always the same. No payments means every dollar stays in the operation. Year 4, 1996, brought the first real test. Drought hit that summer. Not catastrophic, but enough to hurt. Yields dropped 30%. Jake's harvest netted only $38,000 instead of the $60,000 he'd been averaging. But he still made every payment, still covered his expenses, because the debt service was manageable. If he'd been carrying the $50,000 his father had owed, that drought would have destroyed him. Instead, he survived it. Year 5, 1997. Jake made his final debt payment in October, 60 months after his father died, exactly what the original payment schedule called for. The debt was gone, but Jake had also bought an additional 90 acres with cash, had accumulated 6 pieces of paid-off equipment, had saved $30,000 in the bank, and he'd done it all with a tractor his father bought for $300 in 1967. The day Jake made his final payment, he drove to the bank in person, handed the teller a check for $947. "This is my last one," he said. The teller looked it up. "Congratulations, Mr. Henderson. You're paid in full." Jake walked out of that bank and sat in his truck in the parking lot for 10 minutes. Just sat there, feeling what it felt like to owe nothing. Then he drove home, walked out to the machine shed, and looked at the Farmall Super M. The tractor was 44 years old. It had farmed every acre Jake owned for 5 straight years. It had pulled every implement, done every job, never quit, never failed when it mattered. It was beat up, worn out, overdue for another rebuild. It was also the reason Jake still had his farm. Jake Henderson is 57 years old now, still farming. The operation has grown to 500 acres. He runs newer equipment now, tractors from the 90s and early 2000s, all bought used, all paid for in cash. But the 1953 Farmall Super M still sits in his machine shed. Not for working anymore, for remembering. Jake takes his kids out there sometimes, shows them the tractor, tells them the story about their grandfather who died owing $50,000, about the letter that changed everything, about the choice to sell all the modern equipment and farm with a tractor nobody wanted, about living on $5 a day, about making payments every single month while building something on the side. This tractor, he tells them, cost your great-grandfather $300 in 1967. Your grandfather used it to farm for 20 years, then made the mistake of thinking he needed something better. When he died, he owed $50,000 on equipment that got repossessed or sold. He pauses. Lets that sink in. I inherited that debt, and I used this tractor, this $300 tractor, to pay it all off in 5 years while buying 90 more acres with cash. His daughter Judy, who's 16, always asks the same question. Dad, why didn't you just pay off all the debt at once after that first big harvest? And Jake always gives the same answer. Because I needed to feel what the debt felt like. Needed to know what it meant to make that payment every single month for 5 years. Needed to understand why your grandfather wrote that letter warning me never to make his mistake. He looks at her seriously. If I'd paid it off early, I would have missed the lesson. I needed to live in that trap for the full 5 years to make sure I never built another one. So let me leave you with this. Right now, someone's trying to convince you that you need to finance something, that everyone does it, that it's normal, that it's how you grow. But Jake Henderson proved something different. He proved that inheriting debt doesn't mean staying in debt. That old equipment isn't worthless just because it's old. That you can build wealth while making payments if you're willing to live like nobody else. The dad died owing $50,000 in equipment loans. The son paid it off in 5 years with a tractor his father bought for $300. Not because the tractor was special, but because it was free. Because it didn't demand a payment every month. Because it gave Jake the freedom to build instead of just survive. If this story changed how you think about debt, inheritance, and building wealth the hard way, do 3 things. First, subscribe to this channel for more stories about people who escaped financial traps through discipline and determination. Second, drop a comment. If you inherited debt tomorrow, would you have the courage to do what Jake did? Third, share this with someone who's drowning in payments. Someone who needs to know there's a way out, even if it's hard. The lawyer said it was impossible. The neighbors said he was crazy. The bank said he'd fail. But Jake Henderson paid off $50,000 in 5 years with a 40-year-old tractor and a $5 daily food budget. Because sometimes the only way out is through. And sometimes the oldest equipment is the most valuable tool you have. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.